A cell is either dead or it's alive. If an alive cell has less than 2 alive neighbors, it dies as if by starvation. Any cell with 2 or 3 neighbors remains alive. Any alive cell with more than 3 alive neighbors dies as if by overpopulation. A dead cell with exactly 3 alive neighbors becomes alive. And out of these 5 simple rules, incredible structures begin to arise. These 5 rules describe John Conway's game of life. 5 rules sufficient enough to give rise to complex worlds capable of anything. The game of life is as much of a game as is raising sea monkeys. One merely defines an initial pattern and watches the simulation play out over time without interfering in the process. When inventing the game way back in the 1960s, Conway had the goal of finding a few simple rules which give rise to complex emergent behavior. At the time, he did not have access to a computer, so he simulated the behavior of different patterns using a Go board or a blackboard. The game gained popularity in the year of 1970 due to a challenge he made. He claimed that all patterns grow to some finite upper limit, and he offered $50 to whoever can prove or disprove this statement. That same year, a group of MIT students led by Bill Cosper disproved this claim, inventing the first ever pattern that can generate an infinite number of cells. Such patterns are now called guns due to their nature to fire out other patterns. Now, nearly half a century later, the game has progressed tremendously in terms of what we can create with it. The game of life has gained a lot more popularity from its early days, with an ever-growing community, several big creators talking about it, games and research community alike using its rules, and even a little Easter egg hidden by Google if you look up the game of life. The active community, however, is primarily, nerdy, for a lack of a better word. As such, it has invented a lot of very complex and specific jargon which can be intimidating to a newcomer. But let's see if together we can understand some of the basic patterns which we'll see in most other more complex ones. The very first and probably most common patterns you will see are still lifes. These are collections of cells that do not change through iterations unless acted upon by an external force. The block is the most fundamental still life. Each cell has exactly 3 neighbors and such lives to the next iteration, and each empty cell has only 2 neighbors, so no new cells are born. Oscillators are patterns which periodically repeat their state. The simplest one is the blinker, which returns to its initial state after 2 iterations. Spaceships, despite their cool name, term all patterns that repeat after a certain period but at a different location. As such, they appear to be traveling through the board, hence their name. The simplest of them all is the glider, which after 4 iterations appears to have rolled in the diagonal direction it was facing. Guns are stationary patterns which periodically shoot out a spaceship. Above them we have breeders, which generate patterns which themselves generate other patterns. For example, breeder 1 generates guns which shoot out other gliders. There's a whole list of jargons which I'm not going to unpack. Understanding these is sufficient to see the beauty of creation of some of the more complex structures. Just a few patterns and 5 rules and you can rival computers. Yes, the game of life is Turing complete, as you can simulate a Turing machine inside of it. This is a lot of complex automata theory terms just to say that any algorithm, any program that you can write for a computer, you can write in the game of life. Granted, it will be very slow, but at a snail's pace, it will get there. For example, here is a pattern which computes the digits of pi. I had to significantly speed up the process because even on my 8th generation AMD, it takes about 7 minutes per digit. In 2016, Nicolas Loiseau made a fully programmable 8-bit computer with a 32x32 display. Here it is drawing a circle. And yes, you can simulate the game of life within the game of life. As someone greatly interested in emergent behavior from randomness, I got curious. Is it possible to use the game of life to generate sound or music? The idea has long been explored since the 1980s, with notable examples like Cam, Camus, and Chaos Synth. The simplest approach, and the one I've seen most commonly, is to take the current iteration cells and use it as a MIDI file. As we cannot have infinite MIDI, we will limit our grid to 24 cells in the Y direction, representing 24 tones that can be played, 3 octaves, and 16 cells representing 4 groups of 4/16th notes. Alive cells bordering each other in the X direction will become one single note that lasts the duration of the entire group. The patterns across iterations will represent one measure. If we put this into a DAW like FL Studio, we get this. Granted, a lot of the times this sounds terrible. It works okay for drums, sometimes. Let's try something different. The Game of Life works on a 2D grid with an additional time dimension of change, so 3 dimensions total. MIDI works on a 1D grid, all the notes that can be played, with an additional time dimension, so 2 dimensions total. Thus, the Game of Life adds one additional dimension we cannot directly interpret. The frequency domain is 2-dimensional. We have the x-axis, which represents the given frequency, and the y-axis represents the strength of that frequency, or the amplitude. What we could do is take the highest currently alive cell on the grid for each column and use their y position as the amplitude, thus forming a signal. This way we can use the pattern directly as a sound, and over time we form a new, completely alien sounding composition. Let's get back to MIDI. A typical piano has 88 keys. We can arrange them in 11 tones by 8 octaves grid, thus getting a 2D representation of sound. We wrap around the borders again and we get a decent way to transform Cellular Automata to sound. If we keep only the highest note from each group on the x-axis, we can get a usually cleaner sound. In 2009, inspired by the goalie logo pattern, Tom Robinson made a script which, given an arbitrary string, can create a pattern that can continuously output the text on the screen in the Game of Life. Pretty neat, right? But he took it even further. Using the same principles he used for the text, he can get any SVG into the Game of Life. With some edge detection, you can easily input every image into the Game of Life and watch how the simulation plays out. Unfortunately, the Game of Life has only 2 colors, and thus many of the patterns it produces may not be visually appealing. But, as we'll see later, some other rules can produce impressive emergent paintings. The Game of Life is just one of many other such simulations referred to collectively as Cellular Automata. There exist many other similar collections of rules that produce wildly different patterns. Rule 90 is one of the simplest of them all, taking a place on a 1-dimensional grid. For ease of visualization, I will use the 2nd dimension to demonstrate time. With just a single cell in such a setting, we can see patterns emerging that resemble Sierpinski's triangle. Other modifications exist. Ryan's brain distinguishes between 3 different types of cells. As such, 3 colors are used to distinguish between them. The rules are roughly the same, but they create drastically different patterns, generating primarily spaceships. Expanding on the idea of colors, this rule set generates fireworks in Cellular Automata. And this rule set begins from a completely noisy pictures and generates interesting color blobs. You can even do away with the 2D grid and use instead a 3D volume, instead of pixels using voxels. This gives rise to increasingly more complex and visually spectacular structures. Another rule that could be violated is that the Game of Life is strictly a simulation. Life Competes expands upon this by making a massive multiplayer online game based on the Game of Life, where each player have the goal to have as many alive cells as possible. Thus, instead of being a simple simulation, the game becomes competitive and interactive. There exist many other incredible variations of simulations or even two-player games based on a cellular automata. My personal favorite is the sand pile model, which often results in these beautiful kaleidoscopic patterns. Apart from some niche applications, cellular automata actually sees use in practice. They have been used to construct maze structures. Here, a different rule set is applied compared to the game of life, though still each set operates by itself in some local neighborhood. Complex maze patterns begin to arise at random from just a few simple lines of code. Surprisingly, cellular automata also finds use in physics, to simulate quantum fields, study lattice structures, and to simulate the behavior of fluids. They have also exhibited the potential to be used to simulate biological processes, road traffic, and well, anything really, since anything can be simulated within the game of life. If you enjoyed any of this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, as it greatly benefits my channel. Also, if you have friends which might like this type of content, consider sharing it with them. As for the rest of this video, I will leave you with a little art piece in appreciation of cellular automata. I tried to create some loose story from fragmented behavior, though it is still very abstract. Enjoy!